Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. In the last season, we talked a lot about command, dabbled in control, but took a largely tactical land-centric view of C2. In this season, I wanted to focus a little more on the higher levels of C2, operational art, the political military interface from both sides, and of course to tip our lances at some of the windmills of contemporary doctrine. I'm delighted to say that the show is once more sponsored by Systematic.
At Systematic, we make the coordination of fires simple by unifying your operational and fires missions plans into one C4 ISR management platform. The Sit-Aware Fire Support module increases your responsiveness by reducing the time between target identification and fires response, while ensuring full collaboration between all elements involved in the operation.
Back in the 1980s, it was the US Marine Corps that started the debate about command and triggered the conversation that ended up putting C2 into our lexicon that we use today. In many ways, the USMC remain at the forefront of discussions about Western command and control, not because they put thinking ahead of doing, nor that they do both thinking and doing together and do it well, as opposed to being full of rhetoric and backing up not much. The US Marine Corps lead discussions about C2 because they do it with everyone, across joint agencies, with other US armed forces, and with allies and partners. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the Pacific, where the US Marine Corps are busy making military C2 work with other aligned states, not simply making JAD C2 work because it's been mandated by the Joint Chiefs or some project office in the Pentagon. If you're a military force in the Pacific or thinking about being a military force in the Pacific, the USMC needs to be your first stop in terms of thinking about how to work with and potentially for the Americans. To try and understand all of this a bit more and to get an appreciation as to why the USMC seems to be the only force in the world trying to have a realistic and articulate conversation about C2, I have asked Colonel Lester Ray Gerber to come and have a chat. Ray is based in Hawaii on the staff of the US Marine Forces Pacific. Now, Ray's remarks are his personal opinion. They don't represent those of the USMC, the United States, Pacific Command, or any other institution. So with that disclaimer out of the way, Ray, listen, welcome to the show. Can I start by asking about the US Marine Corps' philosophy of command? Now, you've commanded at a bunch of levels. You've worked in a variety of headquarters staffs. You've done numerous professional military education courses. So I think your experiences lend credibility to your views. Would you agree that there's sort of a distinctly Marine idea of command?
I think your intro that described the Marine Corps' entree into this in the 80s and then in the 90s is apt, and it's also enduring. The Marine Corps would point back to our doctrinal publications, in particular MCDP or Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1, Warfighting, which has a portion of Chapter 4, the back end of it, that specifically talks about our philosophy of command. You alluded to it, and I think in a contemporary discussion, it's just as pertinent as it was when General Gray published that in the late 80s, which describes our philosophy inherently as being driven by the necessity to have decentralized command in order to generate tempo, meaning speed relative to something else. And it also acknowledges the human factors and the fluidity of combat as requiring that same decentralization. That gets expounded upon later in the Doctrinal Publication 6, specifically titled Command and Control. My experience and my bias, I would say, has lent to constantly referring back to those works and then adapting them to a contemporary situation.
It's really interesting because you go right back of the history of the USMC and the people who wrote about it. And there is this idea of decentralized, disaggregated command of fighting in small units. You know, everyone from Holland Smith, the father of amphibious warfare, through Brute Krulak, Chuck Krulak, Jim Mattis, all of those Marines with their various publications across the ages have all come back to this idea of command in a very different way to others understand it. It's very much more around small unit fighting. It's around the idea of the infantry battalion as the basic command unit, which means you have to do command differently. You can't rely on divisional staffs. You can't rely on theatre staffs because you are fighting over widely dispersed areas, right?
That's true. What I would say that's interesting as you explore it, though, is when we talk about the nature of command and control, control can be rendered by training an organization to be prepared for the situations it faces. And so it's this idea that the Marines view every operation, activity, or investment essentially as an actual operation. And every operation should be a rehearsal. And so if you go out and you've set conditions during training that force young decision makers to make those decisions, you're actually rendering command and control later when you don't have the ability to communicate specific intent for that moment to them because you put them in situations prior to that. You've watched how they're going to react. You've honed them against it. And you've allowed yourself to control them through the training that you've imparted upon them. And that philosophy of decentralization then allows you to generate the tempo that we talked about before.
So I think this is interesting. And you're one of the few speakers we've had on that's actually talked about control in this way. And I want to dig into that a bit, if you'll allow me to. Because command, I think we all sort of understand what we mean by command. It's a well-rehearsed argument that, the doctrine sits there and people might have slightly different ways of doing it, but we understand what we mean. Control means something different. In the last episode, we talked to Paul Kendall from the air component about why the air component commanded in different ways and worked in different ways, and then how they delegated much more control down to local commanders. It feels like the USMC and their latest doctrine, the way they're going to fight in 2030, is a lot more about decentralized command, but potentially more centralized control, as they have to centralize their ability to do fires at long range to dispersed groups who would be locally commanded. Do you think that my sort of very rough summation there of 2030 is about right?
I would wholesale agree with that characterization, as the Marine Corps' value proposition to the combined and joint force that you alluded to in your introduction mature, particularly in the Pacific theater. We find ourselves as an organization sitting inside kill chains and attempting to help close those. And so explicitly, you get after what you describe by saying if the Marine Corps is a sensing force and it's helping to make sense, the data must be passed along throughout a kill chain or a kill web, if you have one, to allow something to act. That action might be the Marine Corps, or it might be a combined partner, or it might be another element of the joint force. And so in order to act inside of a kill web or a kill chain, you have to render some type of control through the mechanisms of C2 architecture, for example. And that sometimes runs afoul of the decentralized nature of command that the Marine Corps professes. We are wrestling with that as a contemporary issue right now, alongside the joint and combined force, quite frankly, specifically in Indo-PACOM area of responsibility. So I would say you put your finger on it, and I would say I just wanted to explain that we feel that if you're going to close these kill chains, you're going to have to explore how do you actually effectively render control at echelon.
It's really weird, isn't it? Because we've merged command and control, this sort of C2 phraseology, for so long, that we think that they are intrinsically joined together at every level. And I think Dave Berg is thinking about how you potentially needed to separate these two out to deliver exactly what you described for the fighting force in 2030. Is a very different argument to what most people are having. Most people expect them to be almost co-located again. But as you're explaining, and I think Dave Berger's plan sort of went through, you need to almost break them apart again, right? And have the command can happen at lower levels. The control probably needs to be centralized just because about how you've got to deliver weapons, deliver payloads to the effect that you need to have.
I would agree with that. I would actually say the echeloning of command is unquestionable. There's no doubt, for example, as a member of Marine Forces Pacific, that I'm an assigned and allocated force to Admiral Aquilino, the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and that day to day, most of our time in MAR-4 PAC is under its Fleet Marine Forces Pacific role, working beside the Joint Force Maritime Component Commander, Admiral Paparo. Both of those gentlemen are in command unequivocally, as is my boss, Lieutenant General Journey. But as you look down echelon, the complexities of control in the area of responsibility mean that you have to be inherently combined and joint. You also have to recognize the fleeting moments that require passing of information across boundaries in order to address things at the speed of modern warfare.
But there must be doubts about whether this can be delivered, right? Because theoretically, it's possible to join this in one enormous kill web that is sufficiently resilient that the information warfare tools, the electronic warfare available and used by our adversaries means that potentially it won't work. So if that happens, I mean, this is possibly why The plan has seen a lot more investment in long-range fires, the divestment and investment in different types of capabilities for fighting units, particularly for Marine Forces Pacific, mean that it's structured in a very different way than previous fights. I mean, this is not a set of capabilities at the battalion level that you get necessarily in an army division. It's more divisional fires now that you're finding delegated right down to the control end. Is this because there is some doubt that you'll be able to deliver echelon levels of control to a really dispersed battle? I mean, I can't describe how dispersed the battle space in the Pacific is. It's simply geographically huge. There's got to be on the back of that some usual USMC pragmatism that says, listen, it's not going to work as perfectly as we thought it would. And therefore, what we've got to do is invest some of our hard-won capital, divest ourselves of some capability, make some money available so we can give the battalions who are doing the commanding dispersed, upfront, up close and personal with the adversary. We need to give them some of the capabilities as well that normally we'd find at much higher levels in other military forces.
That's absolutely true. I would say you've alluded to the previous commandant's efforts with Force Design 2030, and what you're seeing with that is a diffusion of capability down to the lowest level possible to provide many organizations throughout the Marine Corps. The Marine Littoral Regiment is the one that first comes to mind as a new unit created during Force Design, but that we've modernized infantry battalions, we've enabled MEF information groups, Marine Air Control groups, etc., with quite a bit of capability to both sense, make sense, and then also join kill chains as required. But you point out, and I think something that's worth exploring perhaps as a follow-on to this, is you have to also put yourself into the situation of envisioning the next potential crisis or conflict. First and foremost, you highlight that a pacing challenge like China, as directed by our national guidance, has explicitly got a set of dominances that they strike to achieve. And the first one of those is actually information dominance, which in Western layperson terms means, do I have assured command and control, and do I have an effective ISRT complex? And have I rendered my potential adversaries' command and control and ISRT complex less effective? And so the Marine Corps recognizes that and says, okay, if that's true, if the challenge that we face through anti-access area denial intends to achieve information dominance first and foremost, you have to plan for devolution of command. You have to accept that there's going to be times when you're disconnected, and local commanders have to be able to proceed within the bounds mostly of what they can sense to strike if required, while also understanding how do they fit in the larger fabric of a campaign being unfolded. So that then speaks to the time that you have to look at this. For example, you might say that the first 12 hours of a potential conflict against a peer would be very violent, most prolific expenditure of resources the world's potentially ever seen. The next 12 days would have a different character. The next 12 months would have a different character. The Ukraine is a version of that, for example. And so I think you have to anticipate all of that and then resource accordingly based off of where you think you provide the most value back to the Joint Force Commander as well as to your coalition partners.
I mean, this is an incredibly difficult thing for modern exponents of command and control to think about. I mean, we're used to very fixed headquarters, usually of a pretty large size now at echelon. Now we're talking about USMC potentially having to operate not just in two different ways with a disaggregated C2 structure that can be broken out, used independently, and then amalgamated back up again. We're talking about something that would then need to morph and change with the dynamism of a campaign, right? So as it moves and shifts and changes, the relative flows of information and connectivity change, the command and control structure is going to have to change as well. How is the USMC dealing with this? Is this a discussion that's happening on the fly? Is it something that's being thought long and hard about? I mean, who's leading this conversation?
I'd say that there's a mixture of leadership here, and it's illustrative of how the Marine Corps, as we've alluded to in my role, for example, I'm an assigned and allocated force to Indo-PACOM. And so my excursions into it are benchmarked against the requirements being levied upon me by the theater. At the same time, the Marine Corps as a service is exploring this as it matures, how force design is going to unfold for the forces it offers for component commanders throughout the world, not just in the Indo-PACOM AOR, but also our response forces that go to Europe or CENTCOM AORs and what have you. The conversation is maturing, and I would say recently the Marine Corps held a command and control integrated planning team to look at this and to specifically get after one of the things you're asking about. One of the things that we're exploring and actually moving towards from both the operating forces as well as the headquarters Marine Corps supporting establishment side is the concept of nodal command and control nodes, all domain or multi-domain nodes at various echelons that allow us to bring together the best of the capabilities that we have limited amounts of, while also plugging in and potentially at times, if necessary, skipping echelons to integrate with both combined and joint forces. And so you ask, how mature is this? We're now talking about people in seats. What type of Marines are going to be sitting in different nodes doing different functions, be that an all domain or a multi domain operations center, an ADOC or an MDOC. And so I would expect to see this continue to evolve. I would expect to see it continue to be resourced against as the Marine Corps matures exactly how it plans on doing this. But make no mistake, we're also actually doing it right now out of necessity.
That's the tension, really. It must be, right? Because limited resources, limited number of hot bodies to put in seats, limited number of specialists to put down. You've got the challenges of the JADC2 experimentation that's going on that wants to amalgamate as much as possible, although the shift going from top down to bottom up means something a little bit different now. You've got what you think you might be fighting in 2030, but you've also got operations which are running right now, plus your crisis response capability. I mean, that's a lot of intellectual effort to share across all these challenges, right?
It is. I think you nailed it. The human capital part of it's probably the most challenging. The amount of specialists that you can bring to bear. The Marine Corps prides itself on the ability to task organize, and I think we do that exceptionally well. When I was in regimental level command, my boss would ask me as a corps level regimental commander that had all of the enablers, what could I do? And I would say, we can do anything you want. We just can't do everything you want. It's a capacity challenge. And so I think the key of it all is to experiment in these things, determine what works, find where you can achieve automation through systems integration to get to machine-to-machine discussions, find where the mythical artificial intelligence and machine learning can assist with automation of things. But applying the human capital to it is really the most critical resource, because you just have a finite amount of that and you have a finite amount of time to expose them, derive those lessons, and then make resourcing decisions.
But the pace of this is also important as well, because actually USMC is moving really fast on these discussions about C2. The rest of the US military, I don't think, is that far behind having these conversations. But some of your allies, whether it's in Europe or Indo-PACOM, are not on the same page at all. They're still very much in stovepipes, only prepared to really fight as single service structures, don't do a lot of joint. And what they do in joint perhaps isn't what you or I might mean by a joint or combined. It's very different. I mean, there's going to be really significant challenges in bringing on these people and integrating them into some kind of multinational combined force, right? I mean, this has got to be a big concern, particularly with how Force Design 2030 looks at integrating allies into the fight.
So it is. I'd say it's a first order issue for the nation, the United States, as expressed in all of our national documents. But let's get beyond that platitude and get to, for Indo-Pacific Command, it's absolutely a front order issue. The things that they're doing with the Joint Fires Network that you mentioned and the Indo-PACOM Mission Network, which is essentially a companion to the Joint Fires Network that brings our partners and allies in, gets after what you described. And I think one of the critical things that we attempt to do as Marines, beside our partners, particularly special operations, but not exclusively, alongside our Army brethren from the multi-domain task force, et cetera, is to practice a little bit of humility while acknowledging other nations that we partner with are going to do things the way that they do them as a sovereign nation. And the best part about an alliance is understanding what their equities are and what ours are. For the command and control aspect of it, what you really get to, the essence of it, is how do I achieve relevant interoperability? Do I do that through systems? Do I do that through liaison teams? Do I do that through combined headquarters? Do I do that through a combination of all of these, which is really what we end up trying to pursue? The nice thing about the Marine Corps right now is that we already had baked in capability. For example, the air naval gunfire liaison companies in each Marine expeditionary force, the L in Anglico is explicitly liaison. And so it allows us to take an organization that's already got mission essential tasks to partner with partner forces and achieve interoperability. And so we found tremendous success with that, as has special operations forces, because it's inherently in their nature. And I think as stand-in forces in the Indo-Pacific AOR, special operations and Marines find that role beside our partners and allies to be a huge contribution to the Joint Force Commander.
And there's no doubt that soft forces are sort of at the spearhead of this discussion in C2. But it also strikes me that certainly in the Pacific, a lot of states that have worked with the US military before are expecting the sort of similar arrangements we had in the 80s, 90s, maybe the early 2000s, where some part of a technical phrase of command and control would be assigned to the US, whether it's operational command, whether it's operational control, tactical command, and that would be chopped across to a US commander, and you'd be working for them. You'd be directly under command, and therefore it makes control that much more integrated. I sense, however, that some of the states in the Pacific will be less than happy with the arrangement, that actually you might be doing cooperation rather than command and control, and it's through cooperation that you'd have to get to this control element. Do you think there's any validity to that?
I think there's absolute validity to that. The nature of partnerships, and in particular, even alliances, has to be done on a country by country, alliance by alliance level. The differences, for example, between our alliance structure with an ally like Australia, where chopping forces is natural and we've been doing it for decades, versus necessarily what we'd be doing with Japanese partners or allies rather, is they're very different, they're very unique, and they're very the circumstances of each requires you to have a working understanding of the alliance structure and then to rehearse that, which we do on a regular basis with the Japanese, the Filipinos, and then with other partners throughout the region. That creates and adds complexity, no doubt. And as you pointed out, it really speaks more towards cooperative activities vice command activities.
But it's interesting then, again, to break out the command control argument and think that, okay, if you remove command from it and it becomes cooperation with control, how you integrate on the back of that, because so many of our systems are built around having command and therefore allowing people to have centrics or whatever the system is to allow it to integrate. When you're at cooperation, which is sort of thought about as a different subordinate level, somehow less valuable than command, there's almost a change of philosophy that needs to happen in command staffs and headquarters that says, yeah, we accept it's going to be cooperation, but we're going to do coordination, orchestration of effects still, and find a way to get through some of the hurdles to make that happen, right?
Absolutely. I think the benefit that we have by conducting consistent rehearsals in the key maritime terrain of the Pacific is you build out your battle space frameworks, and you also have an understanding about what the national proclivities are between alliance partners. And so what you can do is figure out where a given ally is going to do certain things, in what way they're going to do it, and how you need to deconflict that. What we find consistently with our alliance partners is the common framework that we need to make sure that we come back to is common situational awareness of what's going on. And so the essence of that part of control, if you think about C2 in the architectural sense, or C5 in the architectural sense, is really where we see the most value in what technology can bring to bear. It's sharing with our partners and allies a sense of what's going on in the battle space while we concurrently rehearse what they need to do, what we need to do. And since you're doing it in the terrain where you're going to eventually have to do it, not only are you achieving a deterrent effect today, you're potentially rehearsing for a crisis or a conflict and gaining a broader understanding, which actually comes all the way back to our philosophy of command discussion. If you think about command and control potentially not just as immediate command and control of a situation as it occurs, but rather are you setting the conditions so that command is enduring and the control has been predicated by your preparation. We're doing that. We're attempting to do that right now every day by, with, and through the joint force and our partners.
So what is it then that allies need to focus on? If you said it's about, the building block for the control mechanisms is common operating picture, it's situational awareness that's shared across allies between partners. Is this about open architecture systems? Is it about a common system? What is it that they really need to get their heads around?
In complete fairness and total transparency to our allies, they are waiting for us to make certain decisions so they can fast follow. And that is something where I have consistently sat down with alliance partners and they said, if you could tell me where you're going to go with JADC2, for example, or with the Joint Fires Network or the Indo-PACOM Mission Network, we would start to make concurrent investments. And so that is simply highlighting the challenges that you've already alluded to. That is not casting spears at JADC2, and it's certainly not casting spears here locally. Most of our alliance partners say, which direction are we going to go so we can make investments? I will pause, though, and say, I don't want to underestimate how much we already have in common. For example, key information exchange requirements, as you've already pointed out in this discussion, mostly as it relates to the synchronization of fires and effects. Many of our alliance partners are already baked into those systems. For example, in the aviation command and control, you're talking about Link 16, and that doesn't have to be radio, frequency Link 16. It could be a JREAP Charlie protocol over IP. That J series message, for example, is the common denominator of a key information exchange requirement. Likewise, on the landward side, a K series message that allows a firing unit through a FATIDS, the common system that many of our alliance partners use, is already the grassroots level interface for that. Likewise, you've got your tactical assault kit equipment that allows us to share with partners already right now a lot of that information. So I don't want to make it seem like nothing's happening. I think we've got to take what's under the hood today and look forward and say, what can technology bring to bear to enhance that? But partners are often waiting for us to make some decisions about how we're going to build this out. I will say that this is moving with tremendous velocity, at least in the Indo-PACOM region, because there's a lot of opportunity with technology to get to a data-centric environment that has applications riding over top of it that really facilitates a combined network. And a lot of times that's just buzzwords, but in this case, it's actually grasping what technology has already been doing in the private sector for years and making a military application of it.
And I've got to say, it's very exciting to see that, as a bit of a C2 geek, right? To see the developments that are happening in the Pacific and the speed with which they're going. But I wonder how many of these states are going to wait for the US to make a decision and how many are just going to go, listen, we can't wait any longer. The fight is literally around the corner. If we're going to get this stuff in the numbers we require to get it to units, we're just going to go with the best system we can find right now that's affordable to us, and we'll worry about integrating it later. Because there's a moment at which people say, I can't wait, right?
Absolutely. Of course there is. And a lot of the nations that we're working beside have undertaken their own transformations. The three that come off the top of my head, the Marine Corps works most closely with, between Japan, the Philippines, and our Australian allies, have all done similar things. The good news is most of what they're doing is congruent already with the nature of what we believe the Indo-PACOM AOR will require. And so it is not going to be a wildly divergent azimuth shift to bring on new capabilities or increased interoperability, given the nature of technology and what we expect to see happen.
I think the other thing that struck me about what's happening with the USMC and C2 is that not only is this happening in the Indo-Pacific, not only is it happening in frontline units and the new units that are coming out to deal with this specifically, but it goes right back down into the training. So the Marine Corps School of Infantry has revamped its training for entry-level infantry Marines, lengthening the course by nearly half, extending an 8-week course to 14 weeks. New coursework, field training, intended to sharpen the thinking skills of Marines, like to find themselves in more independently operating areas than has been the case in the past. I mean, this isn't just something that's happening on the front line. It's linked right throughout the core structure, right?
It absolutely is. Editorially, I used to joke when I was in Okinawa in the Jungle Warfare Training Center with my regimental-sized group of enablers, who most people would typically say were the nerds of the Marine Corps, about how what the Marine Corps is experiencing right now is the grunts, which is where I grew up, need to get smarter, and the nerds need to get harder. And so you take the two things in concert, but you want to see adaptation and evolution in the hands of, the best the American nation has to offer. Spend some time with an infantry battalion doing training in a really harsh environment and watch those Marines explore what the realm of possible is. It's pretty gratifying to see how it all comes together in the jungle or under the shadow of Camp Fuji, for example.
And the evolution of the Marines in the Pacific continues to move at an incredible speed, right? The thought from where the previous commandant talked about the force design in 2030, turning that into reality in literally 2 or 3 years after the plan came out, has been happening with incredible tempo and pace.
So, yeah, what I would say with that is the Marine Corps is a small organization at its roots. And what happened when the previous commandant released his planning guidance was everybody read it. And everybody then conducted some critical thinking and said, how does this apply to my situation? And began moving out on it, even without the organizational changes that would come along that then complemented the activities at scale and across echelons for that. And so, as you noted, specifically as it relates to command and control, just for the sake of the discussion, given the nature of this podcast, when we created the 3rd Marine Littoral Regiment here in Hawaii, we took an infantry regiment and then we gave it new capabilities, aviation command and control capabilities, some logistics and sustainment capabilities, and then what most people point towards is those sea control, sea denial, long range fires. What I would say the most interesting thing about the MLR has become as the Marines have evolved and matured what it's doing, those command and control capabilities that can plug into combined and joint architectures at echelons historically a regiment would never touch become the norm. And now we've established another Marine Littoral Regiment in Okinawa, which is going to fast follow with many of those lessons learned, which allows us to diffuse, as we talked about earlier, and also thicken those relationships across all domains. And I think that's critical too. It's not just a singular domain like the land domain or only in the maritime realm. We are working rapidly to move into space and cyber along with maritime, air, and sea domains so that we're contributing across all of those in some manner at various echelons.
Yeah, this comes right back to the whole philosophy of command, indeed the philosophy of the US Marine Corps, right? I mean, it's hard-won experience. It's arguing ferociously to make sure the right plan is there at the top and then everyone just getting on with it. I mean, I don't think many militaries in the world would strive for anything less than what the USMC embodies. It's quite an incredible story, and one that fills me with the sense of wonder whether anyone is going to be able to catch the USMC as it goes through this evolution. Do you ever think there's a worry that the pace of change will outpace allies and partners?
I don't think so. I think what we're noticing with certain portions of our allied and partners is they're adapting, they're watching what the Marine Corps did, because many of our allies and partners, their armed forces are not the size of other portions of the U.S. military. And so the Marine Corps offers them something that's roughly analogous. And there's a lot of examples of this. The Japanese ground self-defense force isn't really the size of a large army or what have you. It's closer to the Marine Corps. And so when you look at the amphibious response force that they've created, I would say that the Japanese did that with Japanese characteristics while working beside the Marine Corps partners that they've had for decades. The Australians have a very similar, the ADF is not even as large as the Marine Corps. And so while it's got partnerships with other members of the joint force, the Marine Corps, the dialogue that we have with our partners is we can be something that they look at and say, okay, you're taking risk here. We can't take that risk, but we're interested in where that ends up with you. Or alternatively, they have experiences and they have opportunities where we look at that and say, that's interesting. We'd like to borrow from that and we can adapt to it quickly because we're a small and agile organization. I actually don't worry about outpacing our partners and our allies. They are moving out with alacrity in their own way, and it's pretty gratifying to watch.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Listen, we run out of time. It was a great session and a huge pleasure. I hope we can stay in touch and perhaps make time for another chat in a little bit of time. But thank you so much. We should restate that the views expressed by Ray here do not represent those of the United States, the USMC, MARPAC, or any other institution. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Citaware is trusted by more than 50 nations worldwide, including 17 NATO nations, and is the world leader in command and control software.
As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, please do subscribe and leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming platforms. This really does help us to reach new audiences and spread the word. This episode is produced by AureliusThinking.com and is a show for the Wavell Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.